if I bought that ticket, does that rule out that ticket 23 will not win? If you know I bought this ticket, does that show that ticket 23 will not win? No. It shows nothing at all. It cannot rule out 999,999 other possibilities in each of which I do not win the game. So, we want to establish the truth of this claim. And we use the information expressed in the premise. The premise will rule out possibilities in which this claim does not happen. In an argument with good premises, in an argument with premises that have sufficient information. But we can see this premise will not rule out 999,999 other possibilities in each of which the conclusion fails to hold. So that information is badly defective. It fails to rule out possibilities in which the conclusion is false. Knowing that this is the number of the ticket, we used our imagination. We said, here's another ticket, 23. Does this ticket rule out ticket 23? No. Does it rule out ticket 10869? No. This ticket does not rule out any of the other tickets. Knowing that I bought this one ticket doesn't rule out any of the other tickets winning the game. So that premise is badly defective in terms of its information. And as you correctly saw in the class, it's not a good reason to believe the claim is true. Now, what's the method? The reliable method for establishing how good the reasons are for a claim, how much evidence you have. Let's give a name to what we did when we imagined this possibility, which is not ruled out by the information expressed in the premise. When we imagine a possibility in which the conclusion of an argument fails to hold, and this possibility is not ruled out by the information expressed in the premises of an argument, let's call that a counterexample to the argument. A better word is probably loophole, but the standard word is counterexample. And the counterexample is some situation that could happen in the world in which the conclusion of the argument fails to hold, and it's a situation the premises of the argument cannot rule out. And that shows the argument's premises are defective in at least one way. So the reliable method is the method of counterexamples, or the word I always use, and in my own textbook in critical thinking, is the method of loopholes. The more loopholes you can imagine to an argument, the worse the premises are in supporting the claim that the argument makes. And we can learn when we're at 10, when we're at 5, when we're at 0. And also, we can learn how far down the scale we go as we imagine more and more loopholes. But that is not what this course is all about, because although this course is the study of logic, which is the study of arguments, it is the study of a specific kind of argument, namely a valid argument. And valid arguments, I can now define what validity is. Valid arguments are arguments which are loophole-free. In a valid argument, it is impossible for any one of us, i.e., any human being, to imagine a loophole to the argument. Now, you are probably saying right now, now I know why this course is so popular. I can always imagine possibilities in which the conclusion fails. Thus, all arguments have loopholes. There are no valid arguments. And so this course is the study of nothing. Now I know why everyone wants to get into the course, because we study nothing. Well, unfortunately, that's not true. Not only do valid arguments exist, but there are infinitely many of them. And the good news is that you will not have to study all infinitely many of these arguments. But there are definitely valid arguments. If you want to learn more about how the method of loopholes works, you will need to take a course in critical thinking. Because we do not study arguments other than valid arguments in a course in logic. But at least now you know what the method is. And it's a very powerful method. If you were taking freshman composition, it would be a great method to apply to the study of the essays that you have to write about. You take an essay, reconceive of it as an argument, and then look for loopholes and describe the loopholes. Once we did this several years ago, we co-registered students in critical thinking and freshman composition, and the teacher, the professor who was teaching freshman composition, encouraged the students to use this method in writing about their essays. And we had blind referees. The professor, she did not grade the papers the students wrote for freshman composition. Other people in the department graded them. As you know, the curve for grades in freshman composition is pretty bad. Typically, 70% of the class will get C. There'll be a handful of A's. When students use this method, the grades were extraordinary. We had 60% of the class getting A's, and the other 25% got B's and B pluses. And kids were saying, for the first time in my life, I felt like I knew what I was doing when I was writing about something. But this is a good method. It's the only method, and scientific method falls out of it as a corollary, but we're not going to go into that. Because for our course, we only want to look at valid arguments. Now, we're ready to do something, namely the experience that you need to have to understand what makes logic such an extraordinary subject. You now have the background knowledge necessary to have this experience. So what we will do, well, here's what the experience will be. we will look at an argument in English, and we will see whether or not it is valid. We will look for loopholes. And if the argument has loopholes, we will add to the premises of the argument information which will rule out those loopholes. Remember, loopholes occur in an argument because the premises are deficient in the information that would rule them out. So if we find an argument, if we find in the argument I'll provide for you loopholes, we will then add information to the argument to rule out those loopholes. And then the question is, do we now have a valid argument? And so we want to progress. We want to see whether we can add information to make the argument valid. So that's the experience you'll be having. I'm going to erase most of the stuff on the board. Good. How are we doing at the time? Okay, that clock says 6 o'clock, but it's really 7. Okay. Now, let's start with the following argument. Premise. Okay, Jack jumped out of an airplane at 30,000 feet altitude without a parachute. Conclusion, Jack died upon hitting the ground, i.e., our Earth. Okay, that's the argument. You don't have to know who Jack is. That's the information that you have. Some guy by the name of Jack jumped out of an airplane that was at 30,000 feet altitude above the Earth, and he didn't have a parachute. Conclusion, he died upon hitting the ground. Now, if you had $5 to bet, suppose that you double your money if your bet wins. So if you bet $5, you get $10 if what you bet on is true. Would you bet on him dying upon hitting the ground, or would you bet on him not dying? Who would bet on him dying, knowing this? Be honest. If you had $5, would you put it on him dying? I expect most people to raise their hands. Okay, who would bet that he didn't die, knowing this? Okay, good. 2 honest people, and that's very good. In fact, when we finish with this argument, I hope you will see that whether you bet on him dying or not dying would be the same as betting on whether a flip of a coin will come up heads or tails. If you bet on a coin coming up heads or tails and you're told it's a fair flip and a fair coin, it doesn't matter what you bet on, right? I want to show you the same will be true of this argument. But before we do that, we have to establish, let's assume the premise is true. So that's the information we have to work with. The first question is whether this premise perfectly supports this claim. Is this a valid argument? Is this argument loophole free? Is it impossible for you to imagine a situation where this happens, but that does not happen? Is it impossible? Who can imagine a situation where he does jump out of the airplane at 30,000 feet altitude without a parachute, but it's false that he dies upon hitting the ground?
Well, I have a question. Jack is a human, right? He can fly or something like that.
What's that?
Jack is a human. He's not a bird or anything.
Okay, the first question is an excellent question, a great question. Whether Jack is a human or a bird. If Jack is a bird, all bets are off, because he can easily fly away. Now, here is something about everyday arguments. When we use proper names without qualification, and we are in an environment where we don't all know one another, then the default referent of a proper name without qualification is to a human being. Otherwise, our conversations could be really crazy. I could say to you, I went to a restaurant last night with Joan, and Joan jumped on another table and ate the fish that was on the plate. And you would say, well, you're hanging out with strange women. And I'll say, what are you talking about? Joan is my cat. I brought my cat to the restaurant. And you'll say, why didn't you say so? So, in everyday talk, where not everyone knows one another, if we use a proper name without qualifications to pick out a human being. So the loophole, the possible loophole of Jack being a bird won't arise. So that's an excellent question. It raises the issue of what the restrictions are on everyday discourse and everyday argumentation. So that's a restriction. Okay. Does that now mean this argument is valid?
No.
Who can think of a loophole? Okay, I'm gonna move back. Yeah.
There's plenty of possibilities between that. You can fall into the water.
Okay, let's start with the first one. The first proposal for loopholes, he lands in the water. What does that conclusion say? If he lands in the water, is it false that he lands on the ground? Yes, so there's a loophole. Okay, now, whether he lives or dies in the water, it's still false that he died on the ground. So there are two loopholes. Let me just put the information on the board. Remember, we now want to eliminate those two loopholes. So we need to add information to our argument, which will do that. Okay, adding that information to the argument will eliminate those two loopholes. Did you want to try some more?
Oh, no, you can give somebody else.
Okay, anyone else? Now, is what, first of all, is what we now have with the additional second premise a valid argument? Is that argument now loophole free?
No.
Okay, you think no, what is your loophole?
I have a question.
Yes.
If you would add something else to make it loophole free, would you add, if Jack did not land in the water and he landed on the ground?
Okay, you raise a very interesting question as to how to express the information that we're going to add to the argument. There are various ways we could have done that. My point is, let's not worry about that. But you will see, or if you think about it yourselves, you will see that there are various ways of phrasing what that information is. And sometimes it's a delicate matter as to how to phrase it because it's not clear exactly what the information is. In this case, it's fairly transparent, but it's still an issue. Information needs to be expressed in words so you can convey it to other people, right? Because it's our human languages that carries the information, and languages are very complex because we are complex beings. So, okay, now, are there any more loopholes? Now, a whole bunch of hands went up. Now, your hand was first, and then I'll take you, and then, was your hand up too?
Yeah.
Okay. So, let me get, that's the one bad thing, you'll have to pick up your stuff when I move up and down the rows. Yes?
Was Jack alone on the thing when he jumped?
Okay. Do those premises tell us whether anyone else was on board?
No.
Okay, so what's your idea?
So if someone else comes and has a parachute, but it got caught him, so he didn't die?
Aha. So the idea is there's someone else on board with a parachute who shares it with Jack. And thus Jack does not die upon hitting the ground. So, this is a possibility. That's a good loophole. And it's a possibility we need to rule out. One way is no one else is on board the plane. But I will also say something, because I want you to realize just how complex language can be. Even simple words that no one in this room worries about can in fact have depths they hadn't thought about. What word am I talking about? Without. Does anyone go home at night and worry? I just can't figure out what that word means. Yeah, it's not a problem word for any of us. But it does have depths. Here is what I'm talking about. But first you have to know something about loopholes. If you imagine a situation, remember a loophole is where you imagine a situation in which you have the information expressed in your premises, but the conclusion doesn't hold. And what that shows is that the information in your premises is deficient. It fails to eliminate a possibility in which the conclusion does not hold. If you imagine a situation in which you don't have the information in your premise, that is not a loophole, because it shows nothing at all about whether the information in your premises can rule out possibilities in which your conclusion fails to hold. So a restriction on loopholes is that you must imagine a situation in which you have the information expressed in your premises. Now, what does it have to do with the other person on board loophole? Let's imagine this. Jill is the other person. She has a parachute on. Jack does not have a parachute on. Jack jumps and she jumps at the same time. That premise says nothing whatsoever about no one else doing that. So it's a possibility it can't rule out. Both of them jump at the same time. And she grabs Jack, opens her chute, and the two of them fall in tandem to earth, safe and sound. Now, someone might say the following: that is not a loophole because it describes a situation in which this is false. It's false that Jack jumped out without a parachute, this person says. This person says Jack jumped out with a parachute, but not with one on him. And if you look in a dictionary, the definition of without will not settle this question. Most of you will probably say, not only did he jump out without one on him, he also jumped out without a parachute. But some people will say, no, he jumped out with a parachute, but not with one on him. And this is something about language. Sometimes we see that there are situations that are described by certain words. Some of us think the words do not apply, some of us think they do. And the dictionary does not settle it. And this is such an example. The dictionary won't settle whether or not Jack jumped out without a parachute when he jumps out and someone else jumps out and shares their parachute with him. Dictionaries are finite. They give you finite definitions, but our world is complex and dynamic, very complex, and dictionaries could not possibly account for that complexity. Dictionaries give you the bare bones definition, the minimum necessary and sufficient conditions. You have to abide by them to be using the word correctly. But many times we are confronted with situations where the dictionary doesn't help us. i.e., situations in which two parties disagree about whether the word applies to the situation, and both parties are correct in the dictionary definition of the word. That is to say, both parties are using the word correctly. And this has to do with the complexity of our lives. And it creates situations where we may not know whether or not we do or don't have a loophole. Most people in this room say this is a good loophole. But those people who say Jack jumped out with a parachute but not with one on him when someone else jumps out, they will say it's not a loophole. How do we resolve this issue? The dictionary won't help us because both parties are using the word without correctly in the eyes of the dictionary. So that's a difficult situation. And you're getting the experience of seeing language can create lots of interesting problems and difficulties. Even simple words, we think, hey, no problem, I know what that word means, can have subtleties and depths. Okay. We now have three premises. Let's just assume that that is a good loophole. someone else is on board and shares a parachute with Jack. And so we add that premise to eliminate the loophole. We add that extra information to eliminate that loophole. We now have 3 premises. Do we now have a valid argument? Is there anyone who's confident it is now valid?
I just have a minor point. So based on what you just said, right, the probably infinitely many premises you could keep adding to it, and no amount of premises would be exhausted, right? Because they're infinitely, probably arbitrarily many world states, right? So I guess at some point we just have to just stop adding premises to it.
Good, but we're definitely not there. That's, yeah. So what does everyone think? There are more. And does anyone have any loopholes now? Okay, so.
Right, so I have a question, sir. Was he attached to our rope?
What's it?
Was he attached to our rope when he jumped out of the airplane?
Was there what now when you jumped out of the airplane?
Was he attached to our rope?
A rope,
Yeah.
they attached to something.
When he jumped out of the
Yeah.
plane?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't say.
Do the premises say that?
No.
But it might.
But they don't say that.
Yeah, no.
Okay, now how will this work in showing that the conclusion doesn't hold?
I mean, like, it says like he jumped out of the airplane, but it doesn't say anything about like him being held.
It doesn't say anything about that?
Like him being attached to something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It doesn't say anything. And so if he is attached, what happens to him?
He.
Right. Good. So that's a good loophole. Yeah. Now, what are some means of attaching to a plane that some of you in this room may have even tried? Not me, I'm not a daredevil, I'd never do that. But has anyone bungee cord jumped in this room? That's good. Used to be popular, not so much anymore, but it's not me, that's not my taste. But does that premise say, do those premises say there is no bungee cord? Now, that's just one method of attachment. Are there other means of attachment to a plane? Besides bungee cords? I mean, this simply says he jumped, but it doesn't say he wasn't attached. So bungee cords are one way of attaching, but there must be many other ways of attachment, because you use just that phrase attachment, and I gave the example of one means, but there must be many others. And so there may be many other loopholes. Now, if we simply say he was not attached to the plane by any physical means, that would take care of all those loopholes. So let's add that premise. Okay. So do we now have a valid argument? Who thinks it is now definitely loophole free? Does anyone have any more loopholes? Okay, now a bunch of hands came up, but I don't know who's came up first. So I'll go from my right to my left. Yes.
they land on anything that breaks the fall?
Okay, like what? What
Like
would break the fall?
a tree or possibly a blow up mat or something? Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
a safety net.
Okay, or other things that could stop the fall would be high things. Do you know where above the earth the plane is?
30,000 feet. Or wherever. Oh, no.
Are there any things that you know of that are 30,000 feet high? Who knows anything that's 30,000 feet high? The top is 30,000 feet above sea level. What is that? Where is it? I thought I heard
Mount Everest?
the
Yeah, Mount Everest?
That helps.
Everest. The Garysaca Peak in Everest is 30,000 feet high. Right? Or just about. Do you know the plane is not there? So that's one possibility for a thing he lands on, but you're suggesting others as well. And although the probability may be very slim that he would survive, it can still happen. By the way, who knows what the height is for a free fall without a parachute? Survival, the person survived, it's 25,000 feet. But this person used other things to help. And if you watch the movies, then you know that the James Bond movies, you can survive any height. They're only movies. Okay, so premise 5, to eliminate your possibilities, we have to say something about he did not then high tree, tall tree. Mattress piles. And etc. That takes into account a lot of things. Those dots, the etc. dots. Is this now a valid argument? Who thinks it is definitely valid? Anyone think it's definitely valid? Who thinks it's still definitely invalid? That's to say there are more loopholes. Okay, does anyone have any more loopholes? Okay, now, actually his was first, then I'll come to you, and then yours. Unless someone has the same loophole. Yes?
He could have died before hitting the ground.
If he dies before he hits the ground, is it true or false he died upon hitting the ground? False. Now, the probability of having a heart attack, a seizure, is pretty high. If you jumped out of a plane and you were not a special stunt jump person, or the old ticker, you know, can't take that stuff. So, to eliminate all the different ways in which he could die, also suffocation, Does anyone know what it's like to breathe when you're accelerating down 25,000 feet? Okay, so I could simply say he did not die while in the air. Okay. But here too, there are various ways of phrasing this. Now, who thinks it is a valid argument, but not sure? Yeah. Who thinks it's definitely not valid? Who thinks if they had time, well, actually, did each of you have different ones from that one? Okay, let's listen to those two. Yes?
So that's assuming nobody rescued him midair?
What's that now?
That's assuming nobody rescued him right midair? Like there's somebody else that came and rescued him that had a parachute?
Okay, so tell me how this works. It's not someone on board, but someone
Maybe there's another plane and
from
somebody else
another
is about to
plane.
parachute.
Yeah.
and sees it happen.
Do you know there are no other planes in the vicinity? Now, that would be very difficult to coordinate, but still, it's physically possible. So, there are no other, you don't know of any other planes in the vicinity because those premises don't rule that out. So that's a good loophole. To rule that out, we'd have to say there were no other planes. And we, not just airplanes, but any,
Not
aerial vehicle, helicopters. Now, vicinity of the jump, that also could be a problem because we can imagine big air currents pushing him off into an area where, like 100 feet above or 200 feet above the ground, there's some sort of special thing going on where they can intercept his flight. But anyway, let's not worry about that. But what that shows is that how we word this can be very important. Now, do you still have a new one?
What if he jumps without, like, if he jumps with something other than a parachute? It's like one of those gliding suits, for instance. He can just jump out.
Yeah, does this say, do these premises say there were no other thing like a hang glider on board? No. So there are all sorts of things that he could use. Let's rule out all of them. Okay,
I have one premises.
yes.
So it doesn't really specify if it was an actual jump or a virtual jump, because there's new technologies that are formed that you can actually like put those on and actually like. So,
Now this is also a very good question.
yeah.
And this is like the first question about what Jack refers to.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we describe situations, this couldn't have happened 30 years ago, but we live in a new age. And when we describe situations, are we describing what is real, or are we describing what's virtual? So, in everyday conversation, here too, the default is, unless we qualify and say, here is what this person did virtually, unless we qualify that, that's to say, when we're with you know, if everyone in this room, if we were all like, you know, tech engineers, you know, involved in creating this material, we wouldn't need to qualify anything. But where we don't know one another, the default is that it's actual and not virtual or not dream. Has anyone actually been to the psych departments? You know, they have virtual reality goggles. Has anyone gone to the psych department and participated in experiments with them? They also have they also have a car. You sit in the car. Has anyone been in that one, in the psych department? That's amazing. Okay, so we won't, you know, that's a very good point you make, and it calls attention to the restrictions on what are legitimate loopholes. That's to say the restrictions in everyday language use. So, does anyone think that they could continue finding loopholes given another hour or two? Yeah. And what that shows is that we already have 7 loopholes, actually many more than 7. We eliminated some loopholes by our wording. Really what that shows is that the information we have in the original argument with just one premise is about as good as the information you have when you're told that the coin will be flipped, and it's a fair coin and a fair flipped. You don't have much information. Even though initially it sounded like a lot, it turns out there's not much at all. It doesn't rule out stunt jumps, for one thing. At any rate, the experience you had in the past half hour is you have to pay careful attention to what the words in an argument mean in order to find loopholes to the argument. Has everyone had that experience? You know, we all had to focus on those words very carefully, right? Now, this argument is written in one natural language, English. There are thousands of natural languages. Logic is not a natural language. It is an artificial language no human being speaks, but it does something absolutely extraordinary. It abstracts away from words and information. Now, what's so great about that, and how much of an abstraction is it? How much does it abstract? Let me now show you how much the language of logic abstracts away from this argument with 8 premises. And once I've done that abstraction, look at what's on the board and tell me how difficult it would be for you to find a loophole. But let me say one thing. Logic does not abstract away from, it always retains, when you translate from logic, from English or any natural language into logic, it retains 5 words. Not, and, or, the phrase if then, and the phrase if and only if. Everything else, it jettisons. Okay. That is how radical logic is. It abstracts away from almost every word and almost all the information the argument expressed. Now, if you were to walk into this room right now, if you were to walk in 20 minutes ago and you saw that argument and you had the knowledge of loopholes, you would be able to determine whether the argument is valid or not. Suppose you just walked into the room right now, and I say, here is an argument with 8 premises and a conclusion, valid or not? How many of you would go to a dean, and if I said this is gonna, you're gonna get graded on this, how many of you go to a dean and complain? How many of you would think I'm crazy to suggest that you could? That's excellent, because that really is what you're probably all feeling. If you don't have the words, you don't have the information, and so you don't have the argument. You need the information, you need the words to determine whether the argument is valid or not. That's the experience you had, right? And it's a lot of work looking carefully at the words. And now here I'm saying, this is all you need. How many of you say that can't be right? How many of you think that's just, it can't be right? Be honest. How many of you think it just can't be right? I mean, that's exactly right. That's the feeling you probably are having. And yet, that is logic. That's why it's so unbelievable. It abstracts away from just about everything except for the words not, and, or, if then, and if, and only if. And it was probably one of the greatest discoveries of the human mind to see that those 5 words can act to channel the flow of information through an argument in such a way that if you start with true information, you wind up with true information. That's all you need, those 5 words. They act like channel devices. They guide the flow of information through an argument. Now, our ancestors, the logic we'll first study, our ancestors had this 2,400 years ago. In the great civilizations in Africa, in the Near East, the Middle East, the Far East, India, they all had this. And it's one of the greatest advances in the history of our human mind. To figure out that those words would do that. To see that you don't need words words and information to determine validity. And also psychologically, this is very powerful because words generate in us emotions, and emotions get in the way of fair assessment, fair critical assessment. When you give up the words, you don't get distracted, your emotions don't get turned on, and you can determine validity of an argument without risking partiality and having your emotions turn on and clouding your good judgment. So that's another reason why logic is very powerful. But it is an abstraction, and it is the most powerful abstraction language known to human beings. Even mathematics is less abstract than the language we will study in logic. So that is the incredible thing about logic. It abstracts away radically from words and information. But those words that it retains do an extraordinary amount of work. And they act like devices. They are devices that channel the flow of information through the argument in such a way that if you start with true information, you wind up with true information. So that's it.